Hi there, and welcome again to another episode of the Language Fuel podcast. This is season 2, episode number 5. Now, before we get into today's topic, and we're going to be carrying on with the 9 events of instruction, I wanted to quickly say hello to Badr Al-Harti. So Badr reached out recently on Facebook and said he listens to the podcast in his car. So hello, Badr, if you're listening. All right, so just to recap quickly in case you haven't been following the last couple of episodes, we're just briefly working through Gagne's 9 steps of instruction. It's a famous instructional design model. Again, not a magical bullet or anything like that, but some really great principles to include when you're planning your lessons and planning your instruction. The first one is to gain the attention of the learners, and we talked about that in the episode that was entitled Is It All About Fun? And I got there because we discussed an article where a woman said, hey, loads of English language teachers in particular think that you have to have really fun kind of gamified lessons all the time. And we discussed that. And of course, you don't have to, but you do need to make sure that people are paying attention and that they're engaged. So that's the first step, gaining the attention of the learner. And then the one after that, we talked about the next 2 stages, which are informing the learner of the objective and stimulating recall of prior knowledge. Then last time we talked about steps 4 and 5, which are kind of like what a lot of people think teaching, quote unquote, the word teaching means, which is presenting the stimulus material and providing learning guidance. So that's actually kind of giving them the information or the knowledge that's the part of the objective. And a lot of people think that it stops there, but it doesn't. These next 4 steps are in fact really, really important. I'm going to cover them all in today's podcast so that we can finish this little mini series, and I'll provide a download in case you're interested in a summary of what we've had to say over the last few episodes. So after you have presented the stimulus, I said last time I like to call that maybe the setup. You're setting up a situation or a scene where learners would need to learn something or to have the new information, and then you provide the guidance, the learning guidance. You then need to do step number 6, which is illicit performance. And that means getting the learner to actually perform that thing. Now, obviously, if we're talking about language learning, what we're wanting to do is to get the learner to produce that language. And remember, like we talked about last time, you need to think carefully about what skill it is that you're teaching. So if you're teaching speaking, you need to get them to perform spoken language. If you're teaching writing, you need to get them writing some things, and so on. If you're teaching listening, then you need to get them practicing their listening skills. So I guess it's the stage of practice. Most of us, probably all of us, don't just hear something once and then suddenly know how to do it. It's just not human nature. We've got a million things that our brain is thinking about all the time. So, we do need practice at, we've been given the new information. We need to practice at putting that into practice. Practice at putting that into practice. That doesn't sound very smooth, but that's essentially what it is. Practice performing that task, or speaking or listening or reading, whatever. And that's not all either. It's not enough just to practice, because I could be practicing it wrong, as far as I know. And the classic one, and if you've listened to the podcast for any length of time, you'll know that I've done a lot of research into pronunciation, taught that for many years. The thing is, if you're trying to get someone to speak, for example, they'll hear the model and they'll have a go at saying it. That's their performance. They're giving it a go. The teacher has given them opportunity to practice. But they're doing it all wrong because it has to go through their brain's filters about what they think, how their mouth works, and so on. So that next step, this is number 7, giving the learner feedback on their performance, is crucial, absolutely crucial for true learning to happen, because the learner will not know if they've nailed it or not. So you're giving them opportunity to perform this new task, the new words, language, whatever skill that you're teaching. Then you give them that feedback. Oh, you need to tweak a little bit here. Oh, you haven't quite got this part right. Let's have another go. And you might do that many times. You might give them many opportunities to practice, and then, many rounds of feedback. So I mentioned last time when we talked about steps 4 and 5, which was kind of setting up and then giving the new language. I said briefly at the end that part could be done ahead of time. And I talked about the concept of flipped learning. So if you're aware of flipped learning, you'll totally know what I'm about to say. So flipped learning is where you don't spend the together time, the class time, whether it's in a group or individual, but that kind of one-to-one or one-to-many time that the teacher's with the learner, you don't spend that time giving the information, which is, setting up and giving the new language, if you like. What you want to focus that time on is these later steps of practice and feedback, because it takes so much longer. And it's really, really important. That's kind of where it all kind of gets in together. So you could present a video and have the students as homework from the day before say, hey, you need to watch this video. It's going to show you some new language and we're going to practice it in class tomorrow. So when you get to class, fingers crossed they've done their homework. And this is the big trick with flipped learning, is that you have to know whether it's going to work with your students. Are they the kind of students who will go ahead and self-access those videos or however you've presented it? Some will, some won't. I'm sure it's not, a black and white issue. Even if you have a class that's particularly good at doing all their assignments and things, there may be a few in there who don't participate, or vice versa. Anyway, but what you do want to spend your time when you're with your learner is giving that feedback. So it's super, super important. Now, feedback can be, I've mentioned 3 different types of feedback here. So one is inbuilt feedback. Now, that's much easier to see in things that are not kind of language lessons. So, if you're teaching a sport, I think the book here even talks about, shooting an arrow to a target. You'll know immediately whether you hit the target because you can see it visually. So it's kind of inbuilt in the task itself, whether you've hit the target or not. With language learning, it's less precise. There's less things inbuilt. However, I could imagine a situation where, say you're practicing ordering food and the waiter, you're doing a role play and the waiter asks you, do you want it spicy, medium or mild? And you say whatever word you think is the word for mild, and it comes back spicy. You'd kind of know, you'd have an inbuilt consequence. That feedback would be sort of automatic, inbuilt feedback. Not quite so straightforward in language teaching, that sort of inbuilt feedback. But in some types of learning, it's very much inbuilt. The consequences are your feedback. It can certainly be manual feedback, and that's probably the most common way, where the teacher is saying, yes, that's the right way to say it, or yes, you've understood the right thing if we're talking about listening or reading. And that's kind of the manual, the teacher giving you the feedback, yep, or no, you need to tweak it here. But there's also what I'm calling automatic. Now, that's different from inbuilt. Inbuilt feedback it's part of the task itself. It will happen because of the natural consequences of doing the task. Automatic feedback, I am using that term to say it's built in by the teacher in an online learning kind of a way. And by that, I mean, you can program some tasks online if you were choosing to teach online, where, selecting an option A or B for what you're choosing will then give you feedback. So some of that feedback can be automated by the teacher. So the teacher has to certainly program it. But the most common way is, of course, the manual, the teacher being right there with the student. If you are a premium member of the Language Fuel community, you'll know that we have many online courses, and we have moved to some different technology that allows us to do a whole lot more automatic feedback. So you might be enjoying some of that if you're doing our courses. All right, so we talked about eliciting performance, i.e. get the learner to practice, providing feedback, super, super important. Then the last 2 steps are assessment and helping learning retention and transfer. Now, assessment is double checking that the learner can really do this. So you've done a lot of practice and giving feedback, so you've hopefully got the learner to get it right. Then an assessment is kind of making a judgment as to whether the learner has it right reliably and validly. So the words reliability and validity are 2 big words when we talk about assessment. Reliably is kind of what it sounds like. Every time that learner is in that situation, they will reliably be able to produce the correct language. So that's sort of ongoing. And valid means that the situations you're judging are real. We talked about this a little bit yesterday. It's not a kind of a fake situation where you think that, yep, the learner will be able to do it in real life if your situation that you're practicing in is really not resembling real life. So is the task valid? Is it something that as close as possible resembles the natural place where they would use that language? So those are the two things you're looking at in assessment. I don't think this is giving us the impression that you have to assess learners every single time you see them. So I don't want to give you the impression that you should be assessing people all the time, kind of formally. But certainly the teacher should be mentally assessing students, because it's your own feedback as a teacher to know whether or not your lessons are hitting the mark and whether you think the students have got it. So whether that's a formal assessment process, which you will definitely sometimes do, or an informal assessment process just inside your head, or maybe even just in a quick note, student notes if you're keeping portfolios of your students. It's definitely part of the teaching process. And the final one is one of my favorites because it's something that most people forget about: enhancing retention and transfer. Now, retention, hopefully you understand what that means. You remember the new language, obviously, that you have learned. Transfer is being able to go out of the classroom and immediately put it into practice in real life. Now, as I've said several times already in this series, if you're building tasks that do resemble real life, this should be much easier. If for whatever reason that's a little bit difficult, you may need to do something purposeful at this stage to help your learners to remember. So there's a couple of different strategies you can put into place here. So clearly repetition is something that's going to help keep that knowledge in your learner's head. So if you have the luxury of having students for many weeks, you want to be planning repetition of the new language out. So repeat it quite frequently initially, then maybe weekly, and then maybe monthly, whatever it is, so that, becomes very, very familiar, that new language. You might want to talk about cues. How can something in the real world trigger a memory to help them know what to say? There are some, inbuilt or natural kind of cues, and I've talked about this before sometimes. Your senses, your 5 senses in the world should help you remember things. So if you're going to talk about a latte or different coffees, you want to be smelling it, feeling the hot cup, as many of your senses as possible. You want to be engaging, which will be cues for helping them remember some of the things. And then, of course, there's the classic kind of printed material. Sometimes they call it job aids when we're talking about workplace training. So that could be some cue cards or a poster on the wall to help people remember what to do in this certain circumstance. It could be an online tool, a knowledge base. How do I remember what to do? Those are workplace kinds of things, but you can apply them as much as possible in language learning. Sometimes when I have downloads for these podcasts, I like to have little wallet cards that you can just pop in your wallet or something to help you remember what we've been talking about, or downloads in general. All of those things will help with transferring that knowledge to a real world situation. All right, that's us. That was 13 minutes. It looks like a wee bit longer than the kind of 10-minute target that I like to keep to. Thanks for listening. We have now completed our series on Gagné's 9 events of instruction. Hopefully you found a few things that are of interest to you and a few things to help you as you go about doing your language teaching practice. I will put a download on this episode, so we'll get a quick summary of these 9 steps for you so that you can transfer it to your real life when you're planning your lessons for your students. Thank you very much for listening. I would love to hear any feedback. We'll be posting this in the Language Fuel Community Facebook group. It's a free group to join, so if you're not in there already, hop on in, give us some feedback, get the discussion going in Facebook. It'd be great to connect with you. And in case you're not aware, we do have a premium level of membership, which allows you, gives you access to all of our courses online as well. So a little bit more formal training in that area. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. Ka kite anō, and I will see you next time. Thank you for listening to the Language Fuel podcast. You can see more at www.languagefuel.com/podcast, or you can see us on YouTube at youtube.com/languagefuel.